Where these other things, and that's getting to your question of soft skills, let's say, the ability to communicate on a personal level, to make a connection with somebody, to stop and listen, to communicate clearly, to articulate your words, to think about other people instead of yourself. Those are all things that are teachable. And so when we start looking at leadership development, we're really looking at what can we influence, what can we have an impact on that is teachable. And it turns out the majority of things are. Welcome to the Science of Leadership, the podcast dedicated to helping you become a better leader. Here, you'll gain valuable knowledge, hear inspiring stories, and learn the scientific principles that promote exceptional leadership. I'm Tom Collins, your host, and I'm thrilled to have you join us on this journey to becoming a better leader. Joining me today on the podcast is my friend and colleague, Dr. Justin Hamrick. He's a pediatric anesthesiologist, cardiac anesthesiologist, and pediatric intensive care physician. We've known each other for years, and I'm delighted to have him as a intermittent co-host on the Science of Leadership. Justin, thanks for being on with me, and I'm looking forward to some great discussions.
Well, TC, I really appreciate you having me on here. I'm super excited not only about this podcast, but about the topic in general. When you asked me to do this, just 1,000 things started flowing through my head. I think to start off this, I'd have one question for you. How would you define leadership? I mean, let's put the building blocks in there. Let's talk about what we're going to be talking about. So how would you define leadership?
Yeah, no, that's a great question. I'm a person who really likes to define terms because I think words matter. And I think that so much in our society now, people are just throwing around words left and right without taking into consideration what they really mean. And so I appreciate the opportunity to drill down on what is leadership. And as you know, I've done a lot of work in this space for research and study and things. So I would say that fundamentally, the key component of leadership is influencing other people. And the definition that I typically would use is influencing someone else to achieve a common goal. That's pretty straightforward and simple. I think that the major thing that you don't hear in there is any conceptualization of management, administration, position, any of those sorts of things. So it really is, it's more about just influencing others to achieve a common goal.
That's interesting. You mentioned it as a characteristic. I think we talk about like people's character and people's characteristics. If you thought about leadership, is this something that you find that people are born with, or something that can be taught, or sort of a combination of the two?
Yeah. Another really important question. People have studied these things at length, and I can say that the data show that it's really both. And initially, when we look back, leadership, the study of leadership has been going on to some degree for over a century, where people have really studied this scientifically. Initially, they had what's called the great man theory. People are just born to be great, to be leaders. George Washington was just born a great leader. Alexander the Great was just born a great leader.
Came out of the womb like that.
Right, exactly. And there's nothing you can do about that. And if you're not a great leader, well, it's too bad for you. You can be a follower or whatever it may be, right? And so that has evolved over time. And then people said, well, maybe that's not true. Maybe it's people have certain character traits. They're honest, they're forthright, they have integrity and honor and courage and all these different things that we usually attribute to leaders. Maybe it's that. Maybe it's behaviors. Maybe it's a certain skill set. Maybe it is your ability to work within a situation. So there are multiple theories of leadership that have been developed, and 5 really big ones. And I've kind of run through those just now. But looking at skills, behaviors, characteristics, traits, and then situational leadership. Those are the five big ones.
When you talk about
And
those sort of five, and sort of going back a little bit to what
yeah,
you were mentioning earlier, which ones in particular do you think separate true leadership from management, and sort of like separate those two from there? Are there any of those particular sort of qualities or skill sets that really key in on this is where you really divide that flow chart?
well, I think that what I can say is I did a study that we published in Leadership and Organizational Development Journal last year, 2023. We'll link that in the show notes or in the comment section below for the video. But in that study, I looked at 71 experts in leadership, management, administration, so forth, people mostly who are professors who have doctoral degrees at institutions across the country. And I devised this system to be able to differentiate leadership from management. What is leadership to you? What is management to you? Where do these things fall? And consistently within the study, and replicated this in data. So I had an initial cohort and then a follow-up cohort. And really what we saw as far as the top three, the first one was influencing others to achieve a common goal, which I've already said. And that was far and away the most consistent, reproducible definition. On the other end of the spectrum, you have budgeting, planning, financial considerations, those sorts of things. Those were consistently management. And then there was this gradation in the middle, but a very distinct line with regard to different things. And so on the top end, you had influencing others, you had coaching for resilience, and you had modeling behaviors. And so being the example, leading from the front, we would typically call that, with communication, the ability to communicate coming in there as well. On the other end of it, again, I mentioned already budgeting, financials, all that sort of thing, putting out fires. People will say sometimes you're just running around trying to do things, operational things, things of that nature. And so those distinctly segregated, we would say in the scientific literature, into leadership versus management. And that was reproducible. So we had one cohort that completed the study, and then we followed that up with another cohort, and they were identical, what people discerned for leadership versus management.
It sounds like in a lot of these skills for leadership, it really is boiling down to a connection with people. Do you feel like there's certain personality traits in all these people you've interviewed, these great leaders, of like personality traits that they were either born with or have sort of nurtured that really made them strong leaders, as opposed to the manager that's really sort of the nuts and bolts and not really connecting with the people that they're managing?
Sure. So let me come back to this idea of born with versus trained or developed. So in the literature, they've actually identified about 30% of leadership capability is genetically mediated, or that you're born with, quote unquote. Okay. 70% is you learn it, you're trained, you're developed. And so that's really important, because that means everybody has the opportunity to develop their leadership capability. There are certain things, fascinatingly enough, how people look help them to be able to influence others. Clearly, there are people in Hollywood who have certain physical characteristics that allow them to influence other people. Why we should let someone who pretends to be some sort of superhero influence our thinking about national policy, when you really think about that, that doesn't make a lot of sense. But there are things about that person, how they speak, their tone, if they're attractive, that actually influence, or impact, I should say, their ability to influence us. So those things you're born with, the timbre of your voice, you can coach that to some degree, but that is innate, how you look, so forth and so on. Where these other things, and that's getting to your question of soft skills, let's say, the ability to communicate on a personal level, to make a connection with somebody, to stop and listen, to communicate clearly, to articulate your words, to think about other people instead of yourself. Those are all things that are teachable. And so when we start looking at leadership development, we're really looking at what can we influence, what can we have an impact on that is teachable. And it turns out the majority of things are.
Yeah, I think it reminds me of like just many interactions when you're talking about how good leaders influence others to a common goal, how a rising tide lifts all boats. I think of great leaders that have the ability to view not only from their own viewpoint, but from the other people's viewpoint and see what are they going through, what are they doing, and the ability to do that and almost in an empathy situation and help them sort of get through there. It's interesting with those. A lot of times you're like, oh, you're an introvert, you're an extrovert, you don't connect with people, you like to be around people. But you seem to be suggesting that the majority of those can really be taught. Do you think those are taught as you're going along, or is this like an on-the-job training? You've gotten to a leadership role and now you got to try to figure it out.
Well, I think it's both. I think that what happens is those people who may have some innate capability to influence others get more practice, get more opportunity, and are training on the job of being a leader because suddenly people are expecting them to lead. And so they are developing those skills from early on. I think about my son. He was a preemie, and so we had issues with that. He had some gross and fine motor delays, but cognitively, his thinking and his ability to speak were exceptional, remain exceptional. He's 16 now, but when he was 18 months old, he was speaking in 5-word sentences, which is, as you know, way beyond normal with regard to capability. And even though he was a tiny little guy, I mean, when he was like 3 or 4 years old, he was still wearing 18-month-old clothes. He was just tiny. But kids would gravitate to him because he could speak, and he could speak clearly and communicate with all these children. And so they just followed him. And as a result, as he's grown up, he's continued to have those opportunities because they have gravitated to him, and he has continued to develop those leadership skills. Not to mention the fact that I'm consistently trying to introduce him to these concepts, whether they're psychological concepts or whatever they may be. And so as I look at him, he's clearly demonstrated that to me, that he had some innate capabilities that gave him the opportunity to influence others, and he's had opportunities to practice that, and that's only given him more leadership opportunity.
It reminds me of the movie The King's Speech. The entire movie is like, well, okay, well, you're a great leader, but you got to stutter. You can't speak in front of people. So until you do that, you're not going to be an effective king. And they basically teach him how to speak. I want to go back to something you mentioned earlier, which I think is just such an important concept that you've sort of highlighted before, is the difference between leadership and management.
Yeah.
I think so many people that are good at their jobs are promoted into areas where they probably shouldn't be, or they're not prepared for. And they really sort of lean on the management of people and not the leadership of it. Where do you think most people tend to get that wrong?
Wow. That's a big one. This is actually a really important question and concept that's in the literature, the scientific literature of leadership and management. And there's actually debate, as you know, in science. The lay people who aren't involved in that domain think that maybe we have all the answers and everybody's in agreement. But it turns out in most fields of science, there are pretty strong opinions. And so there's this opinion that leadership is an individual entity, which clearly, based on what I talked about earlier with the study we published last year, I believe that leadership and management are different, and I've shown that. But there are people that believe they're the same thing.
Hmm.
And there are people that believe that maybe leadership is a part of management or management's a part of leadership. I'm not disparaging management. We need management, but management and leadership are distinctly different, shown that empirically. And that's important because what people get wrong a lot of times is, and our experience is mostly in medicine and academic medicine, is sort of what you were beginning to allude to. Somebody does well in a certain area and then they get promoted to be a leader, they get put in a leadership position without necessarily having perhaps the skills to lead. They may be really good at managing, budgeting or organizing or planning or whatever it may be, but influencing people toward a common goal, serving as a role model, that's the person I want to be like. Casting a vision, giving people, this is where we're going, come with me. Those sorts of things, they don't necessarily have the capability to do. And there are so many aphorisms that are out there with regard to leadership and management. I think about Rear Admiral Grace Hopper. She was this little lady who was actually a computer scientist way back and was a rear admiral in the Navy. And she said, you lead people, you manage things. And I think that's the nail on the head. There are other sort of aphorisms like leaders do the right thing, managers do things right, right? And so, and John Cotter is a professor at Harvard Business School, and he's talked a lot about change, but also he's written about this idea that they're different and how they're different. And leaders are trying to push the envelope, change things, move into an area of innovation or change. Managers are trying to do really well with things as they are, status quo. How do you make this system work the best it possibly can? Whereas the leader is going, are we in the right business? Maybe we should be doing something totally different.
You mentioned something in all of that I wanted to key on a little bit. And you talked about sort of leaders leading out front, leading by example.
Mm-hmm.
That sort of gets me to the concept of a servant leader. How would you say the servant leader's vision for whatever they're leading is different than the manager? Like how do they seem to have completely different visions for even what they're doing? What do you think the servant leader sort of approaches things like that?
Yeah, well, I'll tell you, we've got a great episode on servant leadership with General Vince Brooks. I think our listeners will really want to tune in to that. But I'm reminded of an interview with one of the Army generals that I did, and he was talking about leadership and management, and he offered a pretty stark contrast between the two. And that was the leader, and he was speaking from a frame of a servant leader, obviously, by what I'm about to say. But the leader will sacrifice themselves for their people. The manager will sacrifice their people for the organization, the financial outcome, the number, whatever it may be. That's pretty stark, but that's the way he framed it. I think there are plenty of managers out there who are great leaders and who have plenty of character and capability and care about the people that they're taking care of. But that was the way he framed it. And so leadership is really more about, it's not about you, it's about the people you lead. Whereas management is about how do we reach this particular outcome in the system that we've got. If that's helpful.
Yeah, I mean, for some reason it takes my mind to sports, and just like the leader you're talking about seems like it would be termed a player's coach. Like there's somebody that the
Sure.
players want to play for. And that's, in my experience, somebody that puts the team before themselves. Whether it's in the interviews before, they're like, "Oh, coach, you did a great job." Like, I didn't do anything. This guy did the things, and that guy did the things, and this lady did the things, and that just it seems like that. That's pretty stark contrast of, because it looks like they both want to succeed, right? The manager and the leader both want,
right.
But the vision seems very different in that I want my people to succeed versus the manager, I want the organization or whatever to succeed, even if I have to sacrifice the well-being or the success of the people.
As physicians, and we have the highest rates of burnout, lack of fulfillment, and disengagement of any professional set of people in the United States of America. And a big component of that is absolutely this issue of leadership versus management. Squeeze in every patient visit possible out of somebody and sacrificing them for the sake of the RVU target or whatever it may be. And I think that's there's probably no, in my mind, no better example of that contrast.
Oh, I 100% agree. I think it's the common concept of, I mean, it's not unique to medicine. It's just the one that I know of. You're good in one thing, so you must be good in everything. And we are,
right,
by the nature of what we do, placed in many roles of leadership, but have never really been given the tools that you talk about. This is actually how you lead. We're taught how to do medicine, how to diagnose, how to treat, but never really taught how to lead a patient care team, how to lead a code or a emergency situation. When you're talking about the military and other places that really put a lot of time and energy into this, where do you see medicine missing the mark on this? Like, how, if you could do anything you wanted to, if you could go back and change the way medicine's taught, what would you change that you think would make the biggest impact into any business, but particularly in medicine, of really making great and training great leaders?
I think it's got to be part of the makeup of the training. I think this is one of the things I'm hoping to do over time, is to influence medical training from the ground level. When we're recruiting trainees, thinking about them from a standpoint of leadership development and what will they be like as colleagues and as future leaders, even thinking about people who are applying to medical school. Wow, if you've got a 4.0 and all that, your MCAT is through the roof and so on, that's great, but you may be a flaming narcissist, and that's not going to go well, because we operate in teams in medicine. We operate in teams, and if we can't work with each other and can't get along in teams and be able to influence each other in positive ways, the outcome for the patient is not going to be what it should be. And so I think that starting early, very early, in introducing these concepts is what we're going to need to do, if, in my perspective, if we're going to have a viable healthcare system in the long term.
When you've interviewed all these military people in very high ranking and obviously leadership roles, do you feel like they've sort of self-selected to those roles, or is there something different in sort of the military apparatus that they've sort of keyed on to really identify or to support and to train people in those leadership qualities?
Yeah. The military is all about training everybody to be a leader, because the reality is, if you storm a building, a beach, a fort, or whatever, and you're the person in charge, you're one bullet away from not being the person in charge. And so every single person needs to be able to step into that position and lead, because attrition happens on the battlefield, and somebody's got to be able to hold their stuff together and get everybody to where they need to go and accomplish the mission. And so because of that, you never know who's going to be the person who goes down or whatever. Everybody's got to have some training in this. So that's just baked in. That is a part of the military. There is some degree of selection, obviously. Those people who perform well and show themselves to be good leaders get promoted and have opportunities to move up in rank. By the time that you get to the level of the people that I've interviewed and have had the privilege to get to know, we're talking about people who've been doing this 35 years, actively leading, actively training to be leaders. It's phenomenal. And so most of them would tell you that they're not special. They've been in a system that developed them and gave them opportunities to train and gave them role models, mentors who helped them to become the leaders they are.
And as you've sort of gone through this and interviewed all these people and done all this work with leadership, have you found that your definition of leadership has changed, and how has it changed?
I don't think fundamentally that influencing others to achieve a common goal has changed. I think that what has come out of this large body of work that I've been doing for 2+ years on this is I've developed a model, a theory, kind of like the 5 things I talked about earlier, but a model of leadership that is the 4 C's that you really need. Anybody who wants to be a leader must have. And over the course of our podcast, over time, we'll kind of talk about those. But those 4 C's really are character first, competence, caring about those you lead, and being able to communicate. If you can't communicate, it doesn't matter how great a leader you are or what degree of capability you have. If you cannot communicate with the people you're trying to lead, you just will not be able to influence them. It's that simple. The one example I use often is think about John F. Kennedy's inaugural address. And he said, "Ask not what your country can do for you, but ask what you can do for your country." And that was beautiful and elegant and eloquent. But imagine if he delivered it in Icelandic. Nobody would have had any idea what he was saying, right? I mean, exactly. It may have been the most eloquent thing in history in Icelandic, but nobody standing on the mall in DC would have any idea what this guy's talking about, right? So if you can't communicate, leadership's going to be out the window. So anyway, but those are the 4 things, and that those 4 domains of leadership, if we call them that, came out of this work that I did.
Wow, it's going to be a lot to unpack as we sort of go through these different podcasts. Sounds like every one of them will have several podcasts on its own, so I don't want to get too much into the weeds of that. I'm just struck by the concept that you said a little earlier, because I think if you asked most people who are great leaders, I think they would mention, some of the great presidents we've had, some of the great generals, Winston Churchill, very famous people. And I think if you ask them, like, have they always been great leaders? Then yeah, they would say, oh, they were born like that. So it's interesting that your sort of research and everything has really proven that really anybody can be a leader. There's only probably 30% that you're born with, but then 70% can be taught, and even the parts you're not born with can be sort of nurtured and all that. I think that's very interesting. One characteristic I'm struck is what seems to be this strong humility in all the statements that you're saying about leaders, that they're putting others first, they're bringing others up. It's this strong humility almost. Have you found that in most of your conversations with it?
Yeah, I think for the most part. So I interviewed 51 on the record, 52 total, but 51 4-star generals and admirals on the record. And among them, I can think of really only one that I would say was not characterized by humility. So it was multiples. The second question I asked every one of them was, tell me a leadership lesson you learned the hard way. And, I had people say, every single leadership lesson I learned the hard way, right? Like I screwed up over and over and over. And so that was a common refrain. There were a few who had a difficult time coming up with a good answer for that. And the one who I would say lacked humility, totally sidestepped it. So for the most part, we're talking about, what is that? 98 point whatever percent. Yeah. Humility was present and clear.
Interesting.
Thank you for joining us on this episode of The Science of Leadership. We hope today's discussion has inspired you and given you valuable insights to help you become a better leader. Remember, leadership is about helping those we lead do great things. It's a journey of continual growth and learning. When we embrace that journey with curiosity, courage, and humility, we can confront challenges, overcome barriers, and foster environments where everyone can succeed. If you enjoyed today's episode, be sure to follow or subscribe, leave a comment, and share it with others who are passionate about leadership. Until next week, keep leading with character, competence, caring, and communication. This is Tom Collins. Let's keep growing.